Second book, and we're going to progressively go faster, is Exodus. And if Genesis was Christ calling the universe into being, Exodus is Christ calling his own out of bondage. And just like the Jews, God today wants to call us out of bondage to sin, just as he took them out of bondage to the Egyptians. In the book of Exodus, we are in the dark splendors of ancient Egypt. As you stand amid Moses and the Egyptian plagues, before him stretches the wonders of the Nile, a world we don't know anything about, this forest of 50 and 70-foot granite and limestone pillars, ornately carved and painted with cartouches. And can you imagine coming into that setting, that incredible mystical world of Egypt, and being an 80-year-old man, and you had to come face to face with the most powerful ruler in the ancient world? I mean, you had to stand there and tell him, "Let my people go," or "My God, whom you can't see and you've never heard of, is going to squash you." I mean, can you imagine that? It's a wonder he didn't get killed on the spot. It's only God's protection that one of those Egyptian guards didn't run him through with a spear on the spot. But Exodus has a three-part message about the way out. Exodus, the whole book, Exodus means the way out. The title of the book is the way out. The theme of the book is Christ calling his people out and shows them the way out. Number one, Exodus has a three-part message. A, the way out of bondage into freedoms, shows that God is powerful. God said, "I want you to know I'm powerful, so I'm going to take you right out of bondage." And this book shows the way out of bondage into freedom is through following the Lord. And the longer we wait in following him out of bondage to anything, the stronger that bondage is on our life. That's why I love to speak to young people and tell them, don't start rotten habits. Because you and I are just a walking bundle of habits. We're just habit-driven. And if you can be very careful what habits you allow in your life and what habits you cultivate and what ones you weed and root out, it will be well for you. And the way out of bondage is to follow the Lord. Secondly, the way out of ignorance into God's law and his program shows us God's holy. And what the Lord does is he takes these people out of bondage, but that isn't enough. It isn't enough to just get out of the shackles of sin. You have to go into something. You have to enter into the knowledge of the Lord. And that's what this whole middle section, chapters 13 to 24, are all about. God's program. God's program is worship. God's program is approaching God. God's program is approaching him his way. And with a holiness, God protected them, he provided for them, he prepared them, and he showed them his program, which is holiness. And all of us should try to be as holy as it's possible for a human on earth to be. That should be our goal. I mean, if you have a goal in life, it should be holiness. What is holiness? It's to be like God. It's to be like him. Now, we'll never be that way until we're glorified. We'll never be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. But God says, Jesus commanded at the end of the 6th chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, "Be therefore perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect." He commanded that because he says it's impossible, but that should be our goal. Our goal should be to be like Jesus. As the hymn writer said, "My desire is to be like Jesus." The third section, the last section of Exodus, is the way out of earthliness. God says that we are earthlings, and he wants us to come into his presence. He says, "I'm friendly. I want you to know me." And that's what the whole 25 to 40 is all about of this book. The tabernacle points to God. The brazen altar speaks about total devotion to Christ, and the laver speaks about him being the cleanser, and the lampstand, he's the light of the world. The showbread, he's the bread of life. The altar of incense, he's the intercessor and priest. And the Holy of Holies speaks of his very presence, sprinkled by the blood of his sacrifice. Even the colors of the tabernacle speak of Christ. White for perfection, blue for heaven, scarlet his sacrifice, purple his royalty. This book is an amazing book. I don't have time to take you through the plagues, but every one of those plagues was showing the impotence of the gods that the Egyptians trusted in. Now you say, well, we don't have any Egyptian gods around today. No, we don't. We have our own gods, and they're still as impotent as the Egyptian gods. We have the god of, health, and the god of beauty, and the god of money, and the god of pleasure. They're all impotent compared to God. I want to close out Exodus with that Romans 3 and 4. There was a final dark plague to fear. God made the 10th plague a horrible picture of ultimate judgment. It was an unspeakable plague. To even imagine the supernatural messenger of doom hunting and killing the firstborn, and you couldn't hide him. Can you imagine going to bed that night and having Moses' words ringing in your ears and say that the firstborn of both your children and the cattle were going to die in the night? And so you just put torches all around the room and you locked the door and you stood in there with your sword and spear. You're going to protect your child. And all of a sudden, you fall off to sleep. When you wake up, you look over, and their head is strangely tilted, and eyes roll back, and they're cold with death. And you say, but nobody got in the room. Can you understand the horror of that you couldn't stop that messenger of death. It was an unspeakable plague. It was unavoidable. There was no place he wouldn't visit. Every family would be noticed, examined, from the poorest to richest, from the huts of the farmers to the ivory halls of the palaces. All would see the dark shadow of death cross their home. It was unstoppable. There was no power on earth that could have stopped that stalking death. It was unexpected. Life was moving along. Business was as usual. That old fanatic was still crying judgment. But it happened. It was unexpected. Sounds just like hell and the wrath of God, doesn't it? People say, oh, it's an old myth. Won't touch me. And God says, no, it's unspeakable, unavoidable, unstoppable. And if you aren't listening, it's unexpected. I put down the last point. There was a full salvation to seek. You know, God didn't want anybody to get killed that night. He offered to all of them, if you just follow the simple little formula, you won't get killed. Okay? Your firstborn won't get killed. Firstborn in your cattle. Firstborn in your family. God's offer was salvation. He gave the ones who would listen the only solution to avert the disaster, the angel of death. He said, you want to avoid death? Do this. Follow my plan. I will save you from it. God's plan was substitution. He detailed a simple act of taking an innocent, spotless lamb to die in the place of a family member. God's method was a sprinkling of blood in the dark. A sprinkle of blood on the doorpost was all it took to find protection. I'll tell you what, a little sprinkle of blood, the blood of Jesus Christ, is all you need to find protection from the everlasting wrath of God. And you know, people, just like the Egyptians, back then they went, sounds dumb to me. I'm not going to do that. Direct the paint on my doors. Put blood on them. And people today say, what? Me? Admit I'm a sinner? Why, people would think there's something wrong with me. What? Do that? That's old-fashioned. And people find every reason not to come to Christ. But God says, my promise is sufficient. Deliverance from death, provision for all they needed, to the promised land with a personal guide to arrive safely. That is a picture of salvation. The 10th plague is a picture of hell. The Exodus is a picture of salvation. And the book of Exodus is a wonderful picture of God calling his people out of bondage.